Yes, let's talk about hockey. The show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. Concluding our look at the NHL expansion class of 1967 that doubled the NHL size and ended the era of the original six, we come to the team from Broad Street, the Philadelphia Flyers.
Upon hearing of the NHL's expansion plans for the 1967-68 season, then Vice President of the Philadelphia Eagles, Ed Snyder, along with a group of a few others, made the successful pitch to the NHL for Philadelphia's inclusion among the new expansion teams over a group trying to bring a club to Baltimore, Maryland. With the franchise granted to them, Snyder's group began construction on a new arena located on South Broad Street, and in April of 1966 opened a public contest to find a name for the new club. Of the 11,000 some odd entries, including names like the Liberty Bells and the Quakers, there was one name that stood out from all of the others. So on October 11, 1967, the Philadelphia Flyers took to the ice for the first time in what would unfortunately be a 5-1 loss to the equally new Oakland Seals Club. It would be a week later on the road against the St. Louis Blues that the Flyers would tally their first win. Then, on October 19th, in front of a crowd of around 7,800, the Flyers made their debut in their new home, the Spectrum, shutting out their cross-state rivals, the Pittsburgh Penguins, 1-0. Led by the likes of Captain Lou Angotti, Leon Rushfor, defenseman Ed Van Impe, and the goaltending duo of Doug Favell and Bernie Parent, the Flyers finished their first year at the top of the NHL's West Division, despite turning out a record that was one game below .500. This success would not transfer over to the playoffs, though. In their first ever playoff series, the Flyers found themselves down 3-1 to the St. Louis Blues, and despite winning games 5 and 6 to prolong the series, Philadelphia was eliminated by the Blues in Game 7. Over the next 4 years, despite drafting promising young star Bobby Clarke and adding other talent like Bill Cowboy Flett and Rick McLeish, the Flyers would continue to post sub-500 records, and the 2 playoff appearances that they did have over this time period ended in first-round sweeps at the hands of St. Louis and Chicago. However, things were about to turn around for the Philly club. In June of 1971, the Flyers hired Fred Shero to take the reins as the new head coach. Then, in the 1972-73 season, the club premiered 2 players plucked from the draft in 1969 and another one from the 1972 draft, Don Saleski, Dave Schultz, and Bill Barber. Barber would put up 30 goals in his rookie year to add to the newly named team captain Bobby Clarke's 37 goals and Rick McLeish's 50 goals, while Schultz and Saleski would combine for 464 penalty minutes, giving the Flyers a newer and much more intimidating look during the 1972-73 season, prompting Philadelphia Bulletin writers Jack Chevalier and Pete Cafone to attach the name the Broad Street Bullies to the club in January of 1973.
The club would finish the regular season ranked second in their division, and with an above .500 record for the first time in the club's history, going 37-30-11. The Flyers then experienced another first that year, this time in the playoffs, when they took down the Minnesota North Stars 4-2 in the opening round to win a playoff series for the first time in the club's history. Unfortunately, Montreal would halt any further playoff progress, eliminating Philadelphia in the semifinals after just 5 games.
The missing piece to Philly's puzzle, though, would fall into place during the offseason, when the Flyers reacquired goaltender Bernie Parent, who they had dealt to Toronto 3 years prior and had just come back to the NHL after a single season with the WHA's Philadelphia Blazers club. Returning a much more seasoned goaltender, Parent would go on to break Terry Sawchuk's record for single-season victories, turning out 47 wins for the Flyers in the 1973-74 season. With the opposition shut down by Parent's goaltending, beaten on the ice by Schultz and Saleski's physicality, and then beaten on the scoreboard by Clarke, McLeish, and Barber's offense, the Flyers finished high atop their division and only 1 point behind Boston for the top spot in the league. In the playoffs, the Flyers started things out with a fighting-filled first-round sweep of the Atlanta Flames. Then, in the semifinals against the New York Rangers, both teams would win all of their home games to take the series to a Game 7, where Philadelphia became the first expansion team to beat an Original Six team in the playoffs with a 4-3 win in that final game. Making it to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time in the club's history, their opponent was the league-leading Boston Bruins. Boston took the first game by a 3-2 score, but the Flyers would even the series in Game 2 thanks to Bobby Clarke's overtime winner, and then take Games 3 and 4 at the Spectrum to build a 3-1 series lead. However, the Bruins would stave off elimination with a dominating 5-1 win in Game 5 in Boston. Back in Philly for Game 6, the Flyers broke out their lucky charm. Since December of 1969, Philly would play a recording of singer Kate Smith singing God Bless America instead of the Star-Spangled Banner before important games. Carrying a 35-3-1 record when starting the game to Kate Smith's song, the Flyers decided for a game this important they needed something more. And so instead of a recording, they had Kate Smith herself show up and lead the crowd in the song. With the stage now set, the Flyers picked up the lead early when Rick McLeish scored a first-period goal. Luckily, this would be all that Philly would need, as Perrant turned aside every shot that the Bruins could throw at him, giving the Flyers a 1-0 victory and the distinction of being the first expansion team to win the Stanley Cup. In the 1974-75 season that followed their Cup win, the Flyers added even more scoring power to their team when they picked up Reggie Leach from California. Stronger than before, the Flyers finished with the best record in the league, with Schultz setting an NHL record with 472 penalty minutes, and Clarke and Perrant repeating as Hart and Vezina Trophy winners respectively.
Getting a bye into the quarterfinals, the Flyers easily swept the Toronto Maple Leafs in the first series of their title defense. Then, in the semifinals against the Islanders, Philly gained a 3-0 series lead and looked to sweep another opponent. However, New York fought back, winning the next 3 games to set up a decisive Game 7. Fortunately, this would be the game where the Flyers were finally able to shut the door on the Islanders, winning by a score of 4-1 to return to the Stanley Cup Finals.
This time, their opponent was the Buffalo Sabres, in the first Stanley Cup Finals to feature 2 expansion teams. The Flyers won the first 2 games at home by scores of 4-1 and 2-1. However, for Game 3 in Buffalo, a literal fog fell upon both teams. Due to an unusual May heat wave and the lack of air conditioning in Buffalo's arena, parts of the game were played in a heavy fog. The Flyers would drop both games in Buffalo, but back in Philly, they would win Game 5 in a dominating 5-1 fashion. Back on the road for Game 6, Bob Kelly and Bill Clement would score in the third period, while Perrant pitched a playoff record 5th shutout to give the Flyers their 2nd consecutive Stanley Cup title, with Perrant himself also becoming the only goaltender ever to win consecutive Conn Smythe trophies for the playoff MVP. In 1975-76, Philadelphia would get a new opponent from outside of the league, when the Soviet Union's Central Red Army team came to the Spectrum on January 11, 1976, as a part of the Super Series 76. Unprepared for the Flyers' extremely physical brand of hockey, the Soviet team left the ice midway through the first period in protest of a hit on Valery Kharlamov by Ed Van Impe. It wouldn't be until the Soviet team was told that they would lose their salaries for the entire series if they didn't finish the game that the Red Army club returned to the ice. By the end of the game, Philly was atop on the scoreboard 4-1 and became the only team to beat the Red Army club in the series. Back with their play against NHL clubs, the Flyers again finished number 1 in their division, thanks to the LCB line featuring Leach, Clarke, and Barber, setting the record for goals by a single line with 141 goals.
Heading into the playoffs without Perrant as their starter, due to a neck injury he suffered earlier in the year, the Flyers were able to edge out a victory over Toronto in 7 games in their first match, and then take out Boston in 5 games during the next round, to head to their 3rd straight Stanley Cup Finals. However, without Perrant between the pipes, the Flyers would fail to establish their dynasty, as they fell in 4 straight to the Montreal Canadiens, a team that would form their own dynasty in the coming years. Despite the loss, though, Philly's Reggie Leach was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy for scoring a record 19 goals in only 16 playoff games that year.
Following their loss, the Bullies squad would begin to be dismantled, starting with Dave Schultz being traded to LA prior to the 1976-77 season, and continuing with head coach Fred Shero's departure to the Rangers in 1977-78 and Bernie Parent's retirement in 1978-79. Though the Flyers have made it back to the Stanley Cup Finals 5 times since 1976, they have yet to recapture the glory of the club from the mid-70s. But with an all-time winning percentage to date behind only the Montreal Canadiens, the Flyers from Philadelphia remain the most successful of the Expansion 6 clubs from 1967.